Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 2. Bored and a bit confused. Fed up at having to try and remember how to spell portmanteau for this week's spelling test and wondering when she would ever use it in a piece of writing, Sophie Hardy was bored. 6 long weeks had passed since she had allowed the many prisoners held at Zatvor to escape to save one of her best friends, Katie. There had been warnings of impending doom being brought upon the earth, carnage to rival what it used to be like, demons being resurrected from the underworld, aliens hell-bent on destroying the earth as it was, obliteration of entire cities, and life changing beyond all recognition. But there was nothing. None of that had happened. Life had just gone back to how it was before, living in the high-rise flat in the poor part of Pinkleton village with her mum, Amelia, dad, Tom, and 1-year-old sister, Lizzie. It wasn't that Sophie wanted any of this supposed destruction to happen. She had just assumed that life would be different to how it had been before the events of late August and early September, but now, in mid-October, nothing had even come close to happening. So, as Sophie stared out of the classroom window, chewing the end of her pen, she saw nothing but the browning trees around the field and the calmness of a world that was completely unremarkable. Sophie needed some excitement. "Are you listening, Hardy?" Mrs. Phoenix, the rather rotund straw-haired supply teacher, barked at her. "No, not really," Sophie mumbled to herself. "Pardon?" Mrs. Phoenix replied. "I said, 'Yes, miss,'" Sophie retorted, patronisingly. Mrs. Phoenix had taken over the class, much to Mrs. Tabard's dismay, after Miss Sissons had left the school due to what she'd coined the return. She had to devote her time to manning scope in case something dramatic ever did happen, and also had to supply every child that was entering Year 7 this year with their internet implant. She also needed to put protocols in place should anything happen to her, because she was now the only person that knew how Shadow was run, so measures had to be put in to prevent a disaster. So she was, by all accounts, rushed off her feet. The girls heard from her occasionally, but most of the time she was silent, busy maintaining cover at what humankind saw as the world's largest tech company. "Number 10. Government," Mrs. Phoenix said in a tone that grated on Sophie. Sophie wrote the word quickly and glanced over at Yasmin, who was sitting opposite her. Yasmin had been voted on to the school council for this year, following a very impressive speech she had given a few weeks ago when the elections had taken place. Sophie didn't catch Yasmin's eye, but smiled at the green badge that was pinned to her school uniform. There was no stopping her at the minute. Everything she touched seemed to be turning out brilliantly, and Sophie was delighted for her, as she knew it was something that Yasmin had always wanted, but never had the confidence to do before. On top of that, she was fast becoming the fashion icon of the school, with some new shoes and a new shorter hairstyle, which was being copied by girls, and some boys, throughout the school. Yasmin also loved training at Scope. She and Sophie had taken to it like ducks to water, and every evening, and most weekends, the pair of them would log in and access the vast array of training programmes in Scope's library. Yasmin was missing her dad, though, as she'd hardly seen him in the last 6 weeks due to some new job he'd been offered. Again, she didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he must be important, as he was always away on business. Number 11. Isosceles. Again, Sophie wrote the word, but was getting even more frustrated. This wasn't difficult anymore. Spellings were easy. She leant her head on her left hand and gazed out of the window again, so that Mrs. Phoenix couldn't see her face. This meant she could log into her implant undetected. There had been strict rules imposed on Sophie and Clara since their parents had gotten used to them having one. Not logging into them during school time was at the top of the list. Yasmin's mum and dad, when they had been there, on the other hand, were a lot more relaxed about it, giving Yasmin a lot more freedom, but they still frowned upon it being used at school. Realising she wouldn't get caught, Sophie typed out a quick message to Clara and Yasmin. "Training tonight," it read. Sophie knew what the responses were going to be before they even came back. Yasmin would go, and they would have a great time, but Clara wouldn't. Out of the 3 girls, Clara had been behaving the weirdest over the last 6 weeks. Before the return, Clara had been loud, confident, brash, and seen by many as a bit of a leader, but now she was quiet and kept herself to herself. She had even stopped hanging out with Sophie and Yasmin outside of school, preferring instead to hang around with her dads. Sophie and Yasmin caught her in scope doing some training occasionally, but not as much as they would have liked, and very rarely working alongside them. They had asked Miss Sissons, but she just smiled and told them that she would be all right in time, as she'd been through a lot in the nightmare programme that hadn't affected her until a few days after, when the shock of it hit. She wouldn't elaborate any more than that, but the girls took her at her word. Number 13. Parliament, Mrs. Phoenix said in an attempt to sound authoritative. 13, Sophie thought to herself. What happened to 12? She must have been logged in and typing while Mrs. Phoenix had said it. Miss, can you say number 12 again? Sophie asked pleasantly. No, I said it twice. I won't repeat them. The power was going to Mrs. Phoenix's head. Sophie thought for a second and decided that getting 19 instead of 20 for once wouldn't do any harm, and so carried on. Just then, the red light flashed in the corner of her eye. Sophie tilted her head back towards the window and read the message. It quite simply read, "Not me." The sender, as Sophie had predicted, was Clara. Number 14, temperature. No problem with that one, Sophie thought to herself, and eagerly wrote the word in the back of her grammar book. Her concentration wandered again. Her gaze was caught by the sight of the empty chair that sat next to Yasmin's. It was where Katie had spent the first few days of the school year, but it had sat empty for the past 6 weeks or so. Nobody had seen anything of Katie or her mum since the girls had placed her in the car outside of Zatvor. Miss Sissons had looked for them, but had no luck. The car had arrived back at Scope after it had dropped Katie off, and Tasha's implant had shown that Katie had arrived home. However, not long after her implant had been switched off, and neither of them were anywhere to be found. The 3 girls had gone to Katie's house to find her, but had come back with a huge blank. There were no perception filters around it like the bin and Clara's, so Katie's whereabouts were completely unknown, but Miss Sissons had assured them that she was looking into it. Number 15. Q. Sophie missed her friend, as did Yasmin and Clara. They all felt responsible for her going missing after what had happened at Zatvor. It was the main reason Sophie wanted to get started with cleaning up the mythicals, but hadn't been given the opportunity yet. Why was it taking so long? Another red dot flashed in her eyeline. She logged in. The message read, "I will, but after tea." Sophie knew she could count on Yasmin. Also, doing it after tea meant that she could put Lizzie to bed again, as Amelia had been feeling a bit unwell lately, and tell her a few more of her training stories, whilst Amelia thought she was reading Lizzie a much more traditional bedtime story. Despite the 3 of them being best friends, Sophie felt happier about having someone to talk to that wasn't Clara or Yasmin. No, Lizzie couldn't talk properly yet, and it was very much a one-way conversation, but just talking about everything out loud made her feel so much better and more real. Sophie found it amazing how attentive Lizzie was during these stories, but she eventually managed to get her off to sleep. What was hard on Sophie, though, was that Lizzie kept waking at almost exactly the same time every night and demanding to eat something, which then Sophie had to oblige with, while Amelia slept in an attempt to feel better. Number 16. Frequently. Before Sophie could put pen to paper, the classroom door was flung open and in walked Mrs. Tabard, completely forgetting to knock. She had a piece of scrap paper in her hand and proceeded to read from it. "You have a new boy starting tomorrow. Please make sure you have everything ready for him. He's moving here from out of town. He did come for a look round yesterday, but you were out doing PE, Mrs. Griffin." "It's Phoenix," Mrs. Phoenix replied. "No, his name's King's Road or something, not Phoenix," Mrs. Tabard snapped back, not seeing the error of her ways. Mrs. Tabard was still a bit disappointed that the school had chosen to hire a supply teacher rather than let her carry on in Year 6, and she hadn't seen eye to eye with Mrs. Phoenix since she started because of it. Nobody was entirely sure if her getting Mrs. Phoenix's name wrong was on purpose or a genuine oversight by Mrs. Tabard. "OK, thank you, Mrs. Tabard. I shall seat him over there next to Sophie, Clara and Yasmin. Nobody has sat in that seat since I started, and I think it's the one spare spot I have left in the room," Mrs. Phoenix said. Sophie glared at her. She had no idea that one of the bravest girls in the universe had sat there just days before she'd begun teaching the class. Clara and Yasmin were also giving Mrs. Phoenix evil eyes, but she seemed completely oblivious to it all and carried on with her test. "She's got no idea," Clara whispered very softly but determinedly to Sophie. Chewing her tongue to not say anything she shouldn't, Sophie agreed wholeheartedly with Clara, as did Yasmin. "Girls, I hope you're listening and not chatting over there," Mrs. Phoenix barked again. The three of them looked at each other and seemed resigned to the mundanity and unfairness that they found themselves in. Katie was gone, and she seemingly wasn't coming back. This random supply teacher, whom none of the children particularly liked or got on with, didn't know what was potentially coming for the world. Nobody did, but the three of them had to keep quiet, or they would either be laughed at for being ridiculous or start a worldwide panic on the off chance that they were believed. Number 17. Embarrassment. Sophie remembered that Miss Sissons had taught her to remember the middle part of that word as really red and super sweaty, so she had no trouble spelling that one. This afforded Sophie the time for another gaze out of the window. On her way to school that morning, she had seen numerous adults glued to their implants. They weren't concentrating on anything except their social media or funny videos they'd found. No wonder people were ignorant of the terror that was supposedly coming. They never turned off and looked at life outside of their screens. Sophie wanted to shake some of them and tell them to wake up and look at the world, but who was going to listen to a 10-year-old? As she sat there doing her spelling test, Sophie realised why people were zoning out so much. Life was dull outside of their screens, and so they used their implants to escape the boring reality. All these adults had lived through times of demons and danger, but now they were becoming complacent and accepting life rather than living it. The children, who hadn't lived through those times and couldn't appreciate the escapism that the adults needed, saw the world differently. Sophie needed some excitement. This living in the real world just wasn't enough anymore. Sophie completed the final 3 words in her test and ended up with 19. Normally she got 20 every week, but, as she thought earlier, it wasn't like getting 19 was the start of the end of the world. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.